Okay. Let's hope things. I mean, they usually start a bit slow, and then they
Yeah,
sort themselves out. Let's summer palace, the summer palace again.
yeah. I think
The
this is
summer
the
palace.
the burn down the palace that has been they have been
Oh right, the Yuan Wing
yeah, the Yuan Mingyuan, yeah. They
re,
have
re,
been
re, revision.
yeah.
Yeah,
They didn't build the whole thing. They just
yeah,
clean it out and did a little bit decorating
no,
things. Yeah. So that's the little decoration that they have. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
At this
Gosh,
time of year, it's really
and
nice
is that
there.
a Chinese? Oh, I can imagine. Anyway,
Oh,
here we are.
here we
Momentous
are.
day. Momentous day. It's
Oh yeah.
clear the opinion polls were all wrong. But anyway, let's press forward. Let's keep
I think
going. Yeah.
the opinion polls, when it's get, I mean, it's actually some of them are correct, saying all the battleground,
Yeah.
the swing states that he was leading. But then, like 1 or 2 days
Mm,
before, I think right before, and then they're saying, "Oh, it's flipping,"
yeah.
etc. I don't think it flipped, but yeah.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
it clearly didn't, and I'm now very suspicious about all of that. I think somebody was playing a game actually. But
Yeah.
anyway, let's press on, and we'll take it
Okay.
from there.
Okay. So, of course, as you said, this is momentous. We were all expecting Trump to win, but
Mm,
he actually won very comfortably. And also, I
yeah,
think that
yeah,
now not all the votes have been counted, but so far it seems like the Republicans going to take both the House and the Senate, which is also
mm,
very
mm.
significant. So, what is your overall take for the whole election result so far?
Well, I think there's a number of things to say. First of all, one cannot underestimate and one shouldn't discount the political force that is Donald Trump. I mean, what he has done has been absolutely remarkable. The only American politician, if Donald Trump is a politician, who has achieved anything like this in modern American history. I mean, you have to go all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. Only he had the same kind of connection with his political base that Trump has, working class political base. And of course, just as um, Trump has broken the pattern by winning the presidency and then losing the presidency and then winning it back, which in modern American history is unprecedented. I mean, it happened once before with Grover Cleveland in the 1880s, but I mean that was a completely different political universe to today. So I mean, you mustn't draw those analogies. The only other person who's done that, in my opinion, to that kind of scale is Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt not only had that connection with his working class electoral base, but he too broke the pattern with elections by winning 4 elections as president in a row, which is pretty astonishing. So, I mean, he is an extraordinary figure. But there were certain things about this election which are very important. Firstly, the obvious thing in America, the economic situation is not as good as the media, the Democrats, the commentariat, all of the economists, all of those people have been telling us. It is much, much worse. I personally think that we've had stagnation in America over the last 4 years, and this picture of growth we are getting is simply understated inflation caused by very high government spending with debt rising all the time, and that explains why living standards have been falling. I mean, normally if an economy was booming you would expect living standards to rise, and instead of that they've been falling. So that suggests that things are not good. And I think this constant pretense that things are getting better when they're actually getting worse, I think that angered an awful lot of people. I have to say this also. I think the foreign policy situation had an impact. Now, I know people always say that foreign policy has little effect on the way Americans vote. I think that's always been exaggerated, actually. But I think this time the foreign policy situation is so bad that I think it cut through. We have a war in Europe, which is a proxy war being waged by the United States against Russia. which the United States is losing, and where people say, that are talking about potential World War III. And I'm sure this has alarmed a lot of people, particularly the very large community in the United States, much bigger than in any European country, which has connections to the military. So that's one thing. The second is we have a disastrous situation in the Middle East, which is getting worse all the time, with Iran and Israel launching missiles at each other, something which has never happened before. Then we also have a very, very bad situation between China and the United States. Now, things were not good between the United States and China when Donald Trump was president. I mean, one has to say that. But they have got much worse since then. We've had a terrible Secretary of State in Tony Blinken. We've had a president who basically lies when he meets Xi Jinping, which is something you should never do. Should never lie to the leader of another country, especially to the leader of China. We've had the United States pumping arms into Taiwan, giving every support that it can to Taiwanese secessionists, going far beyond anything we ever saw during the Trump times. I mean, some of it, as I say, was indicated. We were trending that way. But the Biden people took it far, far worse. And we have people openly talking about war between the United States and China. And again, I think a lot of people in America do not want war between the United States and China. And, we also have other things. We've got North Korea. And, people perhaps don't remember very well, but at least Trump made some attempt to talk to Kim Jong-un. Now Kim Jong-un is, launching more missiles. The military there is getting more powerful. They're forging alliances with the Russians, and lots of other things going wrong all over the world. The political position of the United States around the world has deteriorated significantly. We've had the very successful summit of the BRICS states, which has gone out of its way to make clear that it is not an anti-American project, but which is still something that I think many people in the United States, at least those people who are interested in these things, will find unsettling. So I think all of this cuts through in the end. And people say, well, look, we may not think the world of Donald Trump. He might not be, everybody's person for president, but things were not as bad as this when he was president before. And if we're going to get more of the same, drift to world war with Russia and or China or both of them, and an economic situation that is so bad, well, let us at least try someone else and see whether Trump and some of the very capable people around him, people like Vance, who says he doesn't want war over Taiwan, and people believe him, and doesn't want war with Iran, and I think people believe him over that too, and Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard and all of the others. They say, well, let's just hope that these people can sort things out and calm the situation globally, and perhaps get the economy in the United States working again in a way that actually benefits us, rather than the small group of oligarchs who bankroll the Democratic Party. So I don't think it's that difficult to understand in the end why he won. I mean, he is himself, as I said, an extraordinary individual, but there are objective reasons as well which explain the outcome of the election.
Do you think the Democrats, they overplayed lots of things from the January 6th thing, and they followed with the impeachment, right? And all those preposterous lawsuits. Yeah. And of course, I mean, we don't know what happened, but there were, 2 assassination attempts and I mean, all these things. Do you think they overplayed it? That it doesn't really, in the end, it doesn't help the Democrat. It probably even counterproductive.
I absolutely think that is right. I think they were counterproductive. I think they didn't help the Democrats. They would have worked if Trump had been a different sort of person, if he'd been a more fragile personality, if he'd buckled under the lawsuits, if he'd given up in despair, which, some people do under that kind of pressure. But he didn't, either because he's rather exuberant individual, perhaps because he's lacking in imagination in some way. I mean, but unimaginative people are often difficult to push down or whatever. But in the end, what it made it look like was that the Democrats were obsessed with Donald Trump, and obsessed to a very dangerous degree, which I think an awful lot of people in America just didn't relate to, because Donald Trump has been around in American life for a very, very long time. I mean, he's been, property billionaire. He's a flamboyant character. He's run The Apprentice. He's been president before. People know him quite well by now. And I mean, I don't think they took an awful lot of the things that were said about him especially seriously. So, I mean, you look obsessive, you look vindictive, and that's never a look that you want, by the way. They looked scared because they were talking about Trump as this dangerous person, which made it seem that they were scared of him. And of course, the other thing they were doing is that they were drawing attention to Donald Trump all the time. So, I mean, instead of talking about themselves and their policies and their programs and their own ideas, instead, they were spending all their time talking about Donald Trump. And again, as somebody who's, been in elections, I'm not a campaign chief or anything like that, but I helped my aunt in elections. I've been involved in elections in Britain. Talking about the other side, drawing attention to them all the time is never the wisest policy. You don't want to do that. You want to draw attention to yourself, not to your opponent.
And do you think that replace Biden with Harris is a mistake? Because here's the thing. If you look at the numbers now, the number we got, right now, I think all the swing states, except Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada, they are too close to call. All the rest of them, Georgia, Nebraska, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they all went to Trump. And I think Arizona and Nevada probably will go to Trump too. Michigan, not so sure. So, and then there is also another thing that I was so stunned to hear that somebody asked this question. Now, which part of the country or which county has Harris done better than Biden? 3% better, because I guess below that is not very significant. 3% better than Biden. They couldn't find a single county that she did better. Now that's pretty remarkable. Yeah. So do you think that's a mistake that they did that?
Yes, I think it was. I mean, first of all, it was a mistake to stick with Biden at all. I mean, by the early autumn of last year, it ought to have been clear that he was declining fast, that he was no longer the man that he was, that there were all kinds of problems with him. But again, and I said this at the time, by the way, I mean, you can find our program. I think I even said it here on, in one of our discussions, that changing your candidate 100 days before the election is, to put it mildly, very, very high risk indeed. It tells your voters that you've been gaslighting them for the better part of a year by pretending that Biden is this, tremendous intellect, that he's, all on board and doing all of those things. But also, you're presenting the electorate with a completely untested candidate, one who was not popular anyway. I mean, she was not a successful vice president. So you're presenting them with a candidate, and you're doing so in a way that has left that candidate untested, unproven. The whole thing looked extremely cynical and manipulative, and it was not a good look. It would have been better, I think, to have stuck with Biden. Things can play out in all kinds of strange ways. The fact that he looked old and tired might even have won him some sympathy. People can feel sorry for him. Might be the case that he wouldn't have won, but looking back, it all but guaranteed switching candidates in that way, and in particular in the way that it was done. It all but guaranteed that the Democrats would lose.
Yeah, it's almost like giving people the impression that Democrat was in panic, right? Panic mode, that they give up on Biden 100%, right? That's what they did.
It was, and of course they made it worse because they
Yeah.
didn't follow through with it logically. Because if
Mhm.
Biden was incapable of running for president, then he shouldn't have remained president. If they were going to do this, coming forward and saying, the president has had a sudden problem, his health has just broken down, and for that reason he's standing down, then he could have had Kamala and she would have been the incumbent. She would have been the president.
Yeah.
And, that would have put her potentially in a better position. But instead, they came up with this very, very unsatisfactory compromise. And of course, we didn't know whether she was the candidate for continuity or whether she was the candidate for change. And she was never able to articulate a particular point of view. It would have been much better if they just left things alone and stuck with what they had. And Biden has his base out there in the United States. And as I said, people might have felt sorry for him. And as I said, you'd have probably lost, but it wouldn't have been quite as ugly as it has turned out.
And the one more thing is the identity politics doesn't seem working because somebody pointed out that Trump won twice against women. Both times, he won against women, which means having a women candidate doesn't help you. It doesn't give you much um,
Mm.
advantage at all. So the Democrats should stop this. Should stop, a color minority woman kind of a thing, right? Just to find somebody competent. I think
Yeah.
that's what they should do, right?
Absolutely. Again, I want to push back on one thing that is all over the media this morning. There's a line of thought. You can read it in the Guardian here in London, but I'm sure you're going to see it in the US as well. That Kamala Harris lost because she is a woman. I don't buy that at all. I absolutely do not buy that. The reason she lost is not because she's a woman, but because she was made the Democratic Party's candidate, because she ticks certain boxes. She's a woman, she's black, and those things were seen as somehow more important than whether she's actually somebody who is an effective politician, a capable person, somebody who's able to connect and communicate with people and run departments well and become an effective president. I mean, it is actually demeaning to women to
Yeah.
say that you must vote for someone because they're a woman, which is what the Democrats basically did. And I think it was completely wrong. And it again shows a fundamental failure to understand not democratic politics, but democratic politics in the sense of what makes people vote for a candidate and what not.
Yeah. Also, I think Trump this time, I do think that he has better team.
Mm.
His campaign manager is one guy called Chris Lachivita. The other one is Susie Wells. I think they are very solid Republican operatives. So
Yeah.
they're not very, I would say, obsessive with things. Whereas last time, like a Kellyanne Conway, Paul Manafort, these are I find those people are very swampy people themselves,
Yeah.
the very
Yeah.
typical Washington insider. I do find this time his team is giving me overall impression is better. Is that your feeling too?
Absolutely. In fact, several people are saying that he ran a far better campaign that he has ever done before. Better than
Mhm.
2016, better than 2020. I mean, he ran a strong, well organized, disciplined campaign. He had a strong campaign team, which he stuck with. He wasn't sacking people all the time, and he had a strong group of people around him. Kennedy, Vance, Gabbard, others too. So I mean, it was a much, much more impressive and well put together and thought out campaign. And you saw that also with the convention. The Republican convention was much better organized and far better run than the sort of chaotic things that we've seen in the past.
Okay, now the question is, what are the things you think he would do differently in his second term? There's
Mm.
so many things. Okay, we have to go through this. Um, Ukraine. So, what is going to happen? I guess that Zelensky right now is not very happy. So, what's going to happen?
Yeah. Well, the reports are that, in fact, he's very despondent. And there was a report on one of the Ukrainian channels called Resident, which said that he was in a very, very dark mood over the course of last night and this morning, and that the congratulatory message that has been sent to Trump was not actually drafted by him, which I think is highly likely. Um, my own view is that Donald Trump understands that Ukraine has been a complete disaster. It has been a complete failure. It was utterly misconceived. This war was misconceived. It was all ultimately an attempt to engineer regime change in Moscow, which has failed. It has pushed Russia closer to China when the sort of geopolitical wizards in Washington ought to be trying to bring, to split Russia, to take Russia further from China, brought them together. So I mean, I think he thinks that, and I think anyway he doesn't want to be associated with something that is clearly failing, and I think he's going to want to try and find some way to walk away. I don't think he has a plan to end the war in Ukraine. I don't think he's ever had any kind of plan. I think there's been plans that have been circulating, which are penned by people who are connected to him in some way, but as I understand it, he's never endorsed any one of them. So I don't think Trump has a plan. But what I think he will do is he will distance the United States from Ukraine. So there'll be less money, less weapons, less support for Ukraine from this point on. And I am hoping and I believe that independently of what is going on in Ukraine, there will finally be an attempt to start some kind of dialogue again with the Russians, because that is absolutely essential to secure peace in Europe and to prevent this very dangerous situation escalating and getting worse.
The Chinese media, there's some people speculating that he will get United States kind of out of it, so leave it to the Europeans.
Yeah.
And so it will take its own course, I guess. At some point, Zelensky have to decide whether he can continue or not without much of the support from US. Is that what seems going to happen?
Yeah, well, can I just say, I repeatedly, from what I've learned about you, I've come to the realization that Chinese media has a very, very sophisticated understanding of events in Europe and in Western politics, much more so than the Western media has about East Asian politics or Chinese politics, because I think that is exactly what is going to happen. I think that Donald Trump isn't going to just say, dumping Ukraine, we don't want to see Zelensky win. They're going to say to the Europeans, look, this is your problem. This is your continent. We've done all we can. We've given Ukraine lots of money. We've given Ukraine lots of weapons. We've got lots of other things to worry about. And we've got a general situation around the world where we need to speak to the Russians. If you care about Ukraine as much as you say, you have to take over and run the affair in Ukraine for us, because we can't do more. And I think that is exactly what Donald Trump is going to say. He's going to dump the problem into the hands of the Europeans. That, by the way, is what they're afraid of.
And speaking of the Europeans, so let's start with Keir Starmer. So why did he have a? My understanding, he has a pretty bad relationship with Trump. What caused that? He just doesn't like Trump, or what? What's the reason he have bad relationship with Trump?
It is very difficult to convey to people who are not familiar with the political atmosphere in Britain how intensely disliked in Britain Donald Trump is. I mean, this is universal. It extends from left to right, and everything in between. There's a few people like Nigel Farage who sometimes speak up for Trump, but generally the political class in Britain loathes Trump and is terrified of him. And that reflects a lot of opinion, wider opinion, by the public in Britain as well. And it's not difficult to understand. I mean, Britain is a very liberal country. I mean, that's the first thing to say. I mean, Britain has always been a very liberal country in lifestyle choices, in political attitudes. And a lot of the political class here tends to identify very strongly with liberals in the United States, the Democratic Party, and whatever. A newspaper like The Guardian, for example, or the Financial Times, is as much written for that left liberal American readership as it is for the British. So there is this huge overlap. But on top of that, there is the fundamental and overriding issue of geopolitics, or at least of where the British see their place, which is that the British, ever since the Second World War, have been conscious that their own power objectively is declining. However, they want to remain a major force in global affairs. That means that they want a strong alliance with the United States, which they think they can use to project British power. If the British can't do it, the Americans will help them do it for them. And they are terrified of the Americans moving away, drifting away. And a new administration coming into power in Washington, which says that it wants to be less engaged with the rest of the world, less involved in affairs in Europe, more interested in things that are going on closer to home. That worries the British intensely, because that rather suggests that the British are going to be left behind and out in the cold and exposed to the fact that they're a little island on the fringe of Europe, no longer the center of the world as they've long been. So, I mean, this is the big fear that haunts the British. A couple of years ago, I remember reading an article in Britain, in a British newspaper, saying that the great fear of the British about the United States is that the president of the United States is going to say to the British the same thing that the Roman emperor said in 410 AD, that, Rome has more important things to worry about closer to home, and you must, from this point on, look after yourselves. This is the thing that they're all scared of.
Well, it is hard to understand because we're talking about Britain,
Yeah.
right? Once upon a time was
Yeah.
a mighty empire, and sounds like
Yeah.
to me now it's like they can't live without some support. That that is hard to understand.
Well, I personally find it degrading. And by the
Yeah.
way, there was a line of thought in Britain which also did. If you go back to the 1950s, when the empire was still there, there was a lot of resentment of the United States in Britain at that time. People like Churchill, remember we talked about him? He felt that. He felt that Britain was becoming over dependent on the United States, which is why, as Prime Minister, in his last period as Prime Minister, he was trying to achieve a rapprochement with the Soviet Union. He was trying, as he put it, to end the Cold War, because he felt that would restore Britain's freedom of action and would enable Britain again to assert itself as an important power in the world. So that wasn't unique to Churchill. Even in Ian Fleming's books, the James Bond novels, which were written at that time, you find undercurrents of that kind of thinking. And at that time, a man called Leo Amery, for example, or Enoch Powell, they had those feelings, that those sentiments very, very strongly. But as time has passed, as it has become impossible to imagine Britain conducting an independent policy, even of the sort that was possible, still imaginable in the 1950s, they've clinging on to the Americans even more. And it may be degrading, and it may be humiliating, and every so often some British people do feel humiliated by it. When Tony Blair was involving Britain in all kinds of wars because he wanted to keep Britain very close to the US, many people in Britain were ashamed and disgusted. It nonetheless remains the predominant policy of the British establishment on their global role, or so they think. And without the Americans, they know they can't perform it.
Yeah. Now, how about the rest of the Europeans? Van der Leyen, what is he going to do? And Macron, Scholz. I mean, I guess none of them are particularly happy with this result, I assume. So what are they going to do then?
Well, none of them are happy. They're absolutely appalled by it. The Germans, especially, probably, because the Germans, amongst the European states, have always been the ones who've been closest to the United States since the Second World War. They've had their own reasons for being very close to the Americans, which is they have the Russians nearby. So that's what's made the Germans lean towards the Americans. So they're all horrified. But what they're going to do, or perhaps more precisely, more accurately, what they are going to say is that we now have a situation where the Americans are drifting away. So the answer to that is more Europe. We must
Okay.
all come together and create the great European power, which is going to challenge, well, not the US, because of course, even though they're drifting away, they're still our friends, but the Russians and the Chinese and all of these people, and show, that Europe is still strong. So we're going to see over the next couple of years, in response to Trump, a further attempt by the European leadership to press forward with even tighter integration policies
Within Europe. But do you
within Europe.
Yeah, but do you think they are going to more actively trying to end the Ukraine war? I mean, are they going to do anything that sort?
That is exactly what they should be doing. I mean,
Yeah,
if they acted in a rational way,
yeah,
they would say to themselves, "Well, look, if the Americans are leaving, or are distancing themselves from us, if they're losing interest in Ukraine, then we have to be realistic. We can't win in Ukraine without the Americans. We need to come to terms with the Russians. We need to get the energy flows moving from Russia to Europe again. We need to start resuming our dialogue and our contacts with the Russians. Russia remains, in many respects, a European country. So, we can establish a dialogue with them. But you see, they're not going to do that because they've now worked themselves into this situation where, the Americans are drifting away, but the Russians remain the enemy, the adversary. All of those ancestral fears of Russia have been reawakened. So what they're going to do is the opposite. They're going to say, because the Americans are drifting away, but because the Russians remain this tremendous threat and danger, we need more Europe, remilitarization, building up our armed forces, developing our military industrial complex, etc., to keep the Russians away. So they're going to do the opposite of what they should do. They will not have a dialogue with the Russians. They will be very unhappy if the Americans have a dialogue with the Russians. They are going to try and support Ukraine in whatever way they can. If Ukraine goes down, then they will say the fact that Ukraine is going down means that the threat from Russia is getting even bigger and we must militarize even more. It is a disaster. It is a disaster in the making, but it is what they're going to say.
a little bit like when somebody is really nervous, afraid, then they behave more aggressively,
Mm.
right? Is that what's going to
Yeah.
happen?
Well,
Okay.
that is exactly correct. That is exactly what they're going to do,
Mhm.
and it plays to all the complexes and issues and feelings of inferiority that the Europeans now have, and the insecurities that the Europeans have. This isn't the first time. Again, it's maybe difficult for people in China to understand this, but this fear of Russia has been a constant in European politics since the late 18th century. People look, they see this huge country, powerful armed forces. They're convinced that the Russians are on the march, or that they're going to saddle their horses and gallop to the Rhine. I mean, there's been books and literature written
Yeah.
about this to a degree that it's difficult to understand. And what happens is that every 50 years or so, an international coalition is created in Europe whose aim is to try to defeat Russia. So we had that with Napoleon, we had that with the Crimean War, we had that with the First World War, we had that with the Second World War, we've had that now with the Ukraine War. Always this idea that we've got to defeat the Russians, and if we can't do that, well, that will be an absolute disaster, and Europe will be overwhelmed and destroyed. A very interesting thing, and I don't recommend this, but if one reads or even listens to the speeches that Hitler used to make during the Second World War from 1941 until Germany's end. This was the main theme of his speeches, his wartime speeches. The Germany was defending Europe against Russia. The Colossus in the East was coming for everybody, and that the war that he launched against the Soviet Union was a preemptive war, because otherwise the Russians would have attacked, and he had to do it before they became too strong, and that European civilization was at stake if he and Germany didn't prevail. So you see that this thing repeats itself continuously.
Do you think there's some racist element to it? I find that the Europeans also, even though they were Europeans white, but within that there's also hierarchies. I mean, like Anglo-Saxon probably think they are better than others, and then somehow the Slavic people being regarded as the lower class. Do you think there's some elements of that too? I feel
there is absolutely. I mean, again, I think this is something the Chinese people may have difficulty understanding, because it is so alien to Chinese culture and Chinese society. But Europe is a world where racism is a structural reality. I mean, we have had it all the time. We've always had this idea, that within Europe itself, there's different sort of layers and races and things. It's taken as axiomatic that that Western Europe is more civilized than Eastern Europe, that Western Christianity, how better, mysterious and sinister orthodoxy, that the Westerners are the Democrats, the Russians are the tyrants, and all of that kind of thing. And of course, and this is what's so strange about this, because even as many people in Europe are at some level conscious of Russia's enormous cultural and scientific achievements, which for a relatively young country, because Russia in some ways is a very young country, have been remarkable, there is still the view that the Russians are somehow primitive barbarians. They can barely speak English. They don't know how to, eat food properly with a fork and spoon. And by the way, there was a Swedish film which came out about 15 years ago, in which there was a picture of a Russian girl flying to Sweden on an airplane, and she didn't know how to use a fork and spoon. It's just that kind of thing. Absolutely, that racism is there. And if you go to especially British newspapers, you see it all the time. You see the way they talk. You see people talk about Russian army as a horde, Mongolian horde, which is, by the way, wrong about the Mongols as well, who the Chinese people know an awful lot more about than the Europeans do, by the way, but that's a completely different story. But anyway, but you see all of this, it's all there. As I said, it's not, I think, something that the Chinese people would find very easy to understand. The idea that, say, within China, there are hierarchies, so that people in Sichuan are more inferior to people from Guangdong. I mean, it's something that no Chinese would ever think of, but it is very, very central to the whole culture and history of Europe.
In China, there's a little bit that, because I'm from Shanghai. I feel like people in Shanghai, they look down a little bit on people outside Shanghai.
Yeah,
that's because Shanghai is more metropolitan, more westernized, and so there's some of that. Yes,
there is some of that. But I think it's different. So I mean, it's a little bit like Londoners who look down on the rest of England because they see themselves as somehow more sophisticated and worldly. And there's some truth in that also, by the way, because I mean, London is it's different. But I mean, this is I don't think this has exactly the same kind of racial quality.
Yeah.
There is an inherent sense that Slavs are inferior to Nordics. And, you know, that, and anyway, I mean, all of this is there in Europe. And as I said, it's very difficult for people in China, I think, to understand that.
And that's
I
probably
mean,
explained.
Russians have it as well, by the way. Muscovites certainly think that they're far ahead of people, especially the further into, you know, the interior of Russia you go. They assume that everybody there is far more primitive than they actually really are. And having traveled into the interior of Russia, I can say that is absolutely not true. But, you know, every country has that, especially, you know, the big city, the capital. New Yorkers have it. I've been there many times, so I've seen it myself. So we're talking about something slightly different.
Okay. Well, in that case, I find that the fact that actually Russian is the one Soviet actually is the one who saved the day during World War II must be a very, very hard fact for them to digest, for them to accept, right? Because they're supposed to be superior, but yet they need this inferior people to rescue Europe, right? That must be something hard for them to accept, right?
Absolutely, that is absolutely true. And in fact, a Russian, it was Marshal Zhukov, who was the most important general of the Red Army during the Second World War. He actually said this. He said the Europeans will never forgive Russia for liberating them. I mean, and it's a fact.
Yeah. They have to come to terms with that. I mean, otherwise they just torment themselves. I find it's unnecessarily torment themselves.
Yes, that's
So,
absolutely right.
Yeah. So how about Middle East? Netanyahu just fired his, I think, Gallant, right? He's the defense minister. Now, the two of them had bad relationship for a while, right? That's not a secret. But did he fire him on the election day that everybody expected Trump to win? Does that have anything to do with it?
I think it does. I absolutely do think it does. I think that it's become increasingly clear that Gallant and Netanyahu did not get on. And I think it's also been fairly clear that Netanyahu, rightly or wrongly, believed that Gallant was getting too close to the Americans, by which I mean the Biden administration. There was even an incident about a couple of weeks ago when Netanyahu prevented Gallant from traveling to the United States. He said that he needed to speak to Biden first before he would let Gallant go to the United States. And after he spoke with Biden, he still prevented Gallant from going to the United States. So I think Netanyahu felt that Gallant was the White House, the administration's man inside the Israeli cabinet, and that there were some people in Washington who wanted Gallant basically to become the new prime minister in place of Netanyahu. And I think that the moment Netanyahu sensed that Biden, or that rather the Democrats were going to lose the election, he seized the chance to get rid of Gallant and to replace him with Israel Katz, the foreign minister, who he sees as loyal to himself. So I think this is what this was about. I mean, there were obviously differences between them over military policy, but I think this was the major reason.
But do you think now Trump is elected? Trump and Netanyahu, they're very close, right? They know each other for years and they trust each other. Do you think there will be any differences now that Trump elected?
I wish I could say that I was sure that there would be. I think that Trump's instincts, his visceral feelings, are to support the Israelis fully, to the hill. Where I think there may be a tension is that I think Trump also does not want wars in the Middle East. I think he understands that that would be very bad for him politically, and it would create a crisis for his administration. And he's got people like J.D. Vance, who said quite plainly, war between America and Iran is not in America's interest. So I think that might lean Trump to be rather more, to tell Netanyahu, look, you've achieved an awful lot, but it has to stop now. You've been launching missiles against the Iranians. They've been launching missiles against you. You made your point. It's gone as far as it can, and let's finish here. Now, I hope that is what Trump does. I hope that is the advice he is getting. I can't say with any confidence that it is. And if he is getting that advice because he's Donald Trump, he might go ahead and do the opposite. So we can't be sure about this. We'll just have to wait and see.
And he also surrounded himself with many Zionists, Kushner is one.
Oh, yeah.
And then this Edelson, right? Not him,
Yeah.
Edelson is dead, but his wife, Miriam Edelson. I mean, these are big donors. Miriam and her husband have been giving Trump over $100 million. I mean, that's a lot of money for him to reject, whatever they're trying to say. I think that is a tricky one. Yeah.
That it is a very, very tricky one. Against that, of course, he's not running for re-election again because he's just been elected. He can't become president a third time. So he's not running for re-election. He's got some political space. I hope he uses it, but I'm not confident. I say that without any confidence that he will. We'll just see. We'll just have to wait and see. If things in the Middle East are allowed to continue as they are, it could destroy his presidency. I think that's something he needs to understand. I think a lot of people in America who voted for him are voting for him because they think he's going to be the man who's going to keep America out of wars. If he allows the situation to drift to a place where America becomes involved in more wars, he will see support collapse.
Now, just want to mention that Trump is really good at campaigning. One thing I just saw that the Dearborn in Michigan, where lots of Muslims are there, he actually got 45% of the votes there, and Jill Stein got 30%. Kamala Harris only got 25%. Just so you know.
Well, that tells you. Yeah, that tells you a great deal. He is very good. He is very good at campaigning. And I think also in all of this, I mean, there is a certain degree of hoping, that Biden has been terrible. A whole genocide has played out in Gaza, and he stood by and let it happen. Harris gave every indication that she's going to continue where Biden left off. And people are saying to themselves, well, we know all about Trump, but let's just hope that this time with him, it will be different. And he's a stronger personality, and he's talked about peace. As I said, if he doesn't do it, then all of those people in those sort of places who voted for him will turn against him, and will turn against him very strongly. And at that point, his entire political position in the United States will start to break down. So I hope this is pointed out to him, because it is absolutely clear to me. And we're going back to the first part of our program. One of the things this election was a vote for peace, and not perhaps in a clear straight, because no one here is the peace candidate exactly, but the nearest approximation to one was Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think for some people, they simply felt like they had nothing to lose to give him a chance. Yeah.
Exactly. That is that puts it exactly right.
Okay, now about his relationship with China. Okay. Yeah. So here are the things happening. So Monday, Taiwan just received the first batch of the HIMARS. I don't think it's widely reported, but of course, in China, a lot of people talking about that. And even though it's just, delivered on Monday, but it's actually, the purchase actually was done during 2020. So that was during the Trump administration. So that's one thing. And then in July 2024, I mean, this year, there was an interview he had with the Bloomberg Business Week. And he said, Taiwan should pay us for defense. We are no different than an insurance company. And in general, and then in the meantime, I think it just happened also Starlink. I think Elon Musk asked Starlink people who have business there, who have I think manufacturers in Taiwan, to move out. So there is kind of a panicking mood, right, in Taiwan, and yet we also see the HIMARS, which was done during his time. So I got very confused with what is he going to do next with Taiwan?
Everybody everybody is confused with what he's going to do next. I suspect amongst the people who are confused is Donald J. Trump. I don't think he quite knows this as well. But I'm going to make again exactly the same point that I made just now, which is that the American people do not want a war with China, and they do not want a war over Taiwan. And if he allows the situation to drift in the same direction that it did under the Biden, Sullivan, Blinken team, which, I mean, to be blunt, they are working towards war with China. They have been working towards a war with China. I mean, the way that Biden talks about China is awful. I mean, it is absolutely terrible. If that policy is continued, the United States will find itself in some kind of armed conflict with China, which, by the way, I have no doubt it would lose. So it would be faced with the situation, either it goes nuclear, which some people, of course, would want, or it would lose. And the American people, I think, do not want it. Certainly, most of the people who voted for Trump himself do not want it. Now, I remember very well that one of the very first leaders he met when he was first elected president back in 2017 was Xi Jinping. And he invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago. And it was a very bizarre and very weird meeting in so many respects, because Trump especially was very inexperienced in those days. But at a personal level, they got on. And Trump tweeted all kinds of glowing things about Xi Jinping and how well he got on with him. He was absolutely charmed by Xi Jinping. So, and I always got the sense that that never completely disappeared, that at a personal level, again, the two leaders were able to achieve a degree of understanding with each other. At least they understood each other's personalities and related to each other. Very different from Xi Jinping's relations with Biden, where I think he quickly discovered that Biden was lying to him, as basically he said. So if Trump is wise, he will build with that. Now, he doesn't need to abandon Taiwan. He doesn't need to say to Taiwan, look, go ahead, join China. I'm not involved or interested in you anymore. What he needs to do is to stop this Biden Blinken policy of supporting secessionism in Taiwan. Just say to China, look, I support the one China policy. I'm not going to interfere in events in Taiwan. Stop sending more weapons to Taiwan and leave the situation there alone. If that happens, then the secessionist forces in Taiwan are going to lose ground, because it's the support of the Americans that is propelling them forward. And the realities, the cultural, national realities that Taiwan is China, and it will start over time to reassert themselves as they had previously been doing. The gravitational pull of the mainland is overwhelmingly strong. Just let events take their course, and the problem will solve itself. As it is going there, interfering in it, giving the impression that you support secession, which is what the current administration has been doing, looking for a crisis with China, that has brought the relationship to the point of crisis.
By the way, I think Tucker Carlson had a group of people have been following Trump along during his campaign. One of the time, I think they had a short interview with him on his plane. He actually said once he come into the White House, the first person he's going to call is Xi Jinping. That's what he said.
Yeah.
So
he should. I mean, that is absolutely correct. I personally think he should call Xi Jinping now. I don't think he should wait until he got into the White House. No, seriously. I know there'll be all sorts of people who say that it's against the law and all of that, and they'll bring up that act from the 1790s or whatever it was. But I don't see any reason why Trump and his team shouldn't be in contact with China. And I think
Oh,
they shouldn't just speak. I think they should arrange an urgent summit meeting as soon as possible, because this remains the most important relationship. And if we're talking about the Russians, the Americans will need the Chinese to help them with the Russians also, because the Russians are now so suspicious of the Americans. So a meeting, an actual summit meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump is absolutely the right thing. Again, Trump's instincts in 2017 to hold a meeting early on with Xi Jinping were correct. Of course, he was inexperienced and
mm,
didn't know what he was doing and was listening to all kinds of bad advice and was pulled in all kinds of directions. Hopefully this time he will move forward with that. I hope so anyway.
yeah. Well, the reason he can't contact China right now is because last time, remember, during the time before he came into
Yeah,
office, he was trying to contact the Russian
yeah,
ambassador, I think.
yeah,
And that's the
yeah,
things they used for
yeah.
his Russiagate. Remember, right?
Well,
So
that is exactly. I mean, when I said that that's what he should do, I didn't say
should
that is what he will do.
do. Mhm.
The political constraints on it are incredibly difficult, and I understand that.
Mhm.
But the point I'm trying to make is that this is an urgent priority to sort out relations with China fast. The situation in Taiwan is very dangerous,
Mhm.
and is getting more dangerous by the day. And with Trump only becoming president at the end of January, we still got some weeks left before the current administration leaves office. And given the sort of people they are, there's every potential that they will do mischief between now and January. So, I mean, move fast on that front to try to bring this problem under control.
Well, I think the mainland, lots of the people very happy to
Yeah,
see that there is a panicking in Taiwan
yeah,
because because now they don't know what to do. They're a little bit like the Europeans, like as long as the US tell them you should do this and one, two, three, then
yeah,
they're happy to just do that, which is very clear what the Biden administration have been doing. You know, they have been telling the Taiwan, like you said, the separatists what they should do. And with Trump, I think they're less clear for them because Trump would like to stay away from, tell them to do
yeah,
this and that. I think
yeah.
that's create panicking, and
Yes.
which a lot of the people in mainland actually like that. That's part of the reason people in mainland, by and large, support Trump way more than they support Biden, I think.
That is very interesting, actually. That is extremely interesting. Okay, well, I can understand that,
Mhm.
but as I said, he must now follow through. As I
Yeah.
said, he himself is very confused, and he had this. He still has this idea, which so many Americans have, that the great American economy lost its industrial prowess because China stole all the technology and all that nonsense. I hope that he's going to listen to people like Elon Musk and others who are going to try and make him understand that that is absolute nonsense. And that the best way for the United States is to move together with China to forge that win-win thing, rather than lose on every side
Yeah.
policy, which was because what happened in his previous administration is that he started with that. And of course, it led him into all sorts of other things because
Mhm.
whereas initially it was all about trade and economics, as he understood them, what happened was that he was then pulled along by the anti-China hardliners in the United States, and he found himself in a series when in a situation rather where he was having people like Pompeo and Bolton, and Pompeo especially was intensely anti-Chinese, and is intensely anti-Chinese.
Well, I mean, even the people who support Trump, most people don't have illusions that things will go easy.
No,
But it just
no,
like it,
no,
they kind of like, including me, kind of understand where he come from, right? And he's more
yeah,
upfront about it. Whereas
yeah,
with Biden, He always saying one thing, the two-faced thing, right? Do something different. And you can't
Yeah.
work with somebody like that. And you see, that's where
No,
the
no.
hard part is. Yeah. And if
Absolutely, this is exactly correct. If you're trying to work with someone, even if you are in, there are huge differences between you. If the other person is constantly lying to you, then that makes any kind of progress impossible. There's a very, very famous manual about diplomacy written by a former diplomat who served Louis XIV of France in the early 18th century. And he said the worst thing you can do in diplomacy is lie, because whatever brief advantage you get, what you're going to do is leave poison behind you. And this is absolutely true.
a few follow-up from our previous discussion. So
Mhm.
Mearsheimer, we talked about he was in China, and
Mm.
you were saying
Yeah.
that he probably more find himself more at home in China than, and he actually coming back, he had another interview with one of the, I think the guy's British, I forgot his name, but he had an interview with
Mm.
someone. And he actually said that. He said he just came back from China. He likes going there. And he said
Yeah.
that intellectually, I'm more home in China than I'm
Yeah.
in the US. So he pretty much said what you talked about last time.
Yeah.
That was
Uh,
very
it,
interesting, I
it,
think.
It doesn't surprise me because Mearsheimer is an extremely clever man. I mean, he absolutely is, and a very, very erudite man. And he wants to see the world as it is. He doesn't let his mind get clouded with all of these ideological things. And of course, he finds that Chinese people are like that themselves. They're very clear-eyed, and level-headed, and they're not, uh, talking all the time about values and
Yeah.
democracy and freedom in the kind of way that a certain type of American unfortunately does.
The other thing is we talked about the Thucydides trap. So I've been
Yeah,
giving some thoughts, and also I got some questions and discussions.
yeah,
So one thing I find that how to understand what Thucydides trap is very, very important, because
mhm,
if it is being correctly read by what you were
yeah,
telling us, that Thucydides himself is saying we should try to avoid it. Well, if
yeah,
everybody read it that way, then I think everybody
yeah,
should trying to avoid a war. Well, in that case, then it's less likely we will have a war if everybody is trying to manage whatever the conflict, right, this disagreement. But if it has been interpreted as unavoidable, this trap,
yeah,
Thucydides' trap is unavoidable, well, then of course you have to prepare for war. And if
yes,
everybody's preparing for war, it's more likely to get us into wars. In other words,
yes.
how to read and understand the Thucydides trap in its holistic way has profound impact for geopolitical decisions, isn't it?
I, I completely agree, and I mean this is where, as I said, the distortion of
Mhm.
Thucydides' intention is a very serious matter. Now, I think one thing I have to say is that the common interpretation of the Thucydides trap that you hear all the time, that when one power is rising, and there's another power which has been, which feels threatened about this automatically leads to conflict. It is a product again of European history. I've discussed how very different European history is from Chinese, and the fact that we have had many states that are in constant fighting, constant war with each other, and that the reality of European history, but 1,000 years ever since the fall of Rome, has been of almost constant war and constant struggle. What has happened in Europe is that you've had something very like that, like the concept of the Thucydides trap that people have. So in the 17th century, the most powerful country was Spain, and then France was rising, and that led to a war between Spain and France. France won. Then in the 18th century, the great power was France. Britain was rising. There were lots of wars between Britain and France. The whole history of the 18th century is of repeated wars between Britain and France. The British ultimately prevailed. In the 19th century, it was the British who then become the most powerful. Then in the 20th century, Britain is the major power. Germany appears to be the rising power. So the result is a series of wars between Germany and Britain. And people look at this and they say, well, this has been the trend. And surely there is a scientific explanation for it. And then they go back and they read Thucydides and they find that one sentence that I said, that, these are the reasons that were given for the war, but the underlying reason was the rise of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. And they say, well, he discovered it. Here's the scientific explanation that if one power is big and another power is rising, that automatically leads to conflict. So much about international relations and international relations science is based on an assumption that modern European history has a universal application, that what has happened in Europe over the last 600 years is true throughout history, always and everywhere. And it isn't so. I mean, it simply isn't so. It is an anti-historical point of view. There were objective reasons why within Europe there were all these different conflicts between powers. They don't apply to anything like the same degree in other places. They certainly haven't applied to the relations that China has had with other countries. China, just to repeat again a point which I've made before, has never sought to prevent other countries rising or to extend its dominion over other places in the way that European states have done.
And I also feel like the Thucydides travel kind of like fits very well with some of the war hawks, neocon, neoliberals agenda, because they do have an agenda to constantly get the United States into wars, but they know majority of the American public do not support those ideas, just keep on going to war. So they have to using, I don't know, think tanks and the media, of course, analysts and all these means that they have to theorize, giving their own, hidden agenda some legitimacy. I think that's also part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, if you follow what passes for international relations science in the United States, of which, by the way, Mearsheimer is an exception. I mean, he's a genuine, very rigorous scholar. But if you follow a lot of it, you find this is exactly right. What they tend to do is that they package the policy they want to follow in all kinds of elaborate scientific or pseudo-scientific theories, which inevitably lead to the conclusion that they want us all to follow. And I mean, there are scores of books that you can find like this. There is a British historian called Niall Ferguson, who is an absolute exemplar of this sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's kind of convenient for them. They would say, you see, thousands of years ago, there's already theory about this. So it's not avoidable. So now we are in that situation now. So it gives them lots of cover. Yeah.
Exactly. But to repeat again, the point I made yesterday, that was never what Thucydides himself intended. I mean, that he was always clear that there is agency in human affairs, that people have choices and they can make good choices as well as bad ones. They are not obliged to do something like start a war, which is going to ultimately prove a disaster for them and for everyone else. If you read his history fully and completely, even in English, by the way, you can see that. But he's yanking out quotations from a text is to misunderstand the text or to misrepresent it radically. By the way, in the ancient world, in the world of ancient Greece and Rome, nobody, you'd ask people then, and they're the people who knew close to Thucydides this time. If you'd ask them, what do you think of the Thucydides trap? They wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Nobody, no ancient scholar refers to the Thucydides trap. It has no basis in the very, very strong philosophical literature, for example, that you found in Greece, in ancient Greece, in the decades after Thucydides himself wrote.
Yeah. I mean, if they're serious, they should study how to avoid that trap, right? That's what they should be focusing on.
Yeah.
But instead, they're
Yes.
telling you it's not avoidable. It's a foregone
Yeah.
conclusion. It's not avoidable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That is exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is, of course, you got this letter, email from Parsa from Switzerland regarding the neutrality thing.
Yeah.
I
Pascal.
also got a letter from a Chinese person that I have lived, one of my fans. And so she also wrote me a letter explaining this. I got the feeling now, so the idea is that they have enough signatures, right, to go ahead with this referendum. So that's not something the Switzerland government can stop them, right? So it's happening. It's going to happen. Now, in that case, isn't that clearly the Switzerland government is doing things against the will of the people? That's what the
clearly
yeah.
it manifestly is. Now, I've been in touch with a lot of people in Switzerland about this. In fact, I should say the Durand community has a large number of people who are in Switzerland, and they've all been saying this exact same thing, that the Swiss people are deeply attached to the idea of Swiss neutrality. It's something that is very much embedded in the national psyche, and they are very, very upset and angry with the way their political class has taken Switzerland away from it and has redirected Switzerland into this alliance with the United States and with NATO. And so there is definitely strong feeling about this. But the political class in Switzerland, I'm not a person who greatly understands the Swiss constitutional system. The Swiss political class has tried to avoid having a proper discussion about this. I think that is a thing I would say. And they're obviously resisting these attempts to pull them back to the position, the constitutional and historic position that the Swiss people support. But this is common in every country now. I mean, in every country in the West, we find that the political class is warlike and belligerent and confrontational in a way that the people there are not.
Same thing with Sweden. When I was living there, I told you, right, that the Swedish people are very proud of their neutrality. It's not just we're a neutral country. It's like we think, if all the countries are neutral, the world will be a better place. Because there will be fewer conflicts. That's how they feel about their neutrality.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's very surprising to me that they somehow got into NATO. I just find it because my impression is they would want to stay away from NATO, but
well, indeed, and it was done without a vote, without an election, without a referendum, without anything. I mean, it was on a wave of hysteria, and it was suddenly, from one day to the next, it suddenly happened.
Yeah, and the friend that I talked to, this Chinese woman, she's also very upset because she said that, the reason she moved to Switzerland is she liked the fact that it's a neutral country, not have conflict.
Yeah.
And we were saying that we, the Chinese, a little bit like the Switzerland, right? We want to get along with everybody, not to take side, not to have a small group and, harassing other countries, that kind of idea. So in a way, China is a little bit have some similar way of thinking with the Switzerland people. So
exactly.
But,
Exactly so. And of course, I used to know Finland quite well, and it was the same there. I mean, the Finns had got drawn into the Second World War. They were badly defeated as a result, but they survived as a nation, and they prized their neutrality, which played out very, very well for them. And again, the speed with which all that was dumped and the way it was done without any proper discussion, I think has been shocking to many people in Finland. And of course, what we now have is a government in Finland which has been very actively promoting an anti-sort of Russian narrative in Finland, which cuts completely against the grain of how Finland was developed after the Second World War.
So another race other than the presidential race is, of course, there's a House race and then Senator's race, right? So one of them is the New Hampshire District 2, a House seat that the two person are interesting. Lots of people in China paid attention because one of the candidates, the Republican side, is a woman called Lily Tang Williams. She's Chinese. And her opponent, the Democrat, is Maggie Goodlander, who is Jake Sullivan's wife. So just so you know, it's an interesting race for that reason. Now I checked. I think Maggie Goodlander won the seat, but it got lots of attention. So I looked it up. This candidate Lily Tang Williams, but she actually seemed to me very anti-China, even though she herself is Chinese. She was born in China, but she's, to my view, she's giving speeches to victims of the communist regimes and stuff like that. So very unfortunate. Even though I like to see more Chinese get involved into U.S. politics, but it seems to me like she's not the only one. Gary Locke, I don't know if you remember, the former ambassador to China under Obama. He was also pretty anti-China. He got a very bad relationship with the Chinese government. He has to finish his term earlier because the Chinese government was so upset with him. Those sort of things. So why is that the American Chinese who are interested in politics, why are they, several of them are anti-China?
Well, I am very accustomed to this from, Russian Americans and these Americans, Russian Britons and people of this kind. I think what they feel is that they have to overcompensate by, showing that they're actually, fully loyal to their own countries. And at some kind of psychological level, because they're in a way turning their back on their own motherland. That makes them even more determined to be as rude about their old motherland as they possibly can be. And, you see that. I mean, I was discussing recently a new book that's been written about Russia by a man called Sergei Radchenko about, the current politics of Russia, but going all the way back to the foreign policies of Joseph Stalin after the Second World War. And it is extraordinary how he blames Russia for absolutely everything. The Russians are always to blame. They've always got things wrong. The Americans always had the best of intentions. There was never any possible threat to Russia from the United States. And you find the same with China. You find the same sort of people. I think to a lesser extent, by the way, than you find with Russia. In fact, significantly less, but you will always find some who, because they've repudiated their motherland, feel the need, firstly, to demonstrate their loyalty and at the same time, somehow to compensate for whatever feeling of guilt they have about rejecting their motherland by being angry with it. And it's very sad. It's awful, actually. And it does a lot of harm because people see and hear a Chinese person say bad things about China. And they say they say to themselves, because it's a Chinese person who's saying that, it must be true, which of course doesn't follow at all. But people do say that. Same with Russians. If they hear a Russian come along and say horrible things about Russia, they will assume that must mean that those horrible things are true, because why else would a Russian person say them?
Yeah, in terms of the Gary Locke, I actually think it's very sad in the situation because he clearly is a very smart guy. But when Obama picked him to be the ambassador, so clearly Obama felt that he, being a Chinese American, will be doing well, right? That will be more acceptable probably than a white person to the Chinese government. So he actually should be playing a mediation, being softer toned person, I feel like. But instead, he was very hawkish. He just criticized the Chinese government. First of all, being a diplomat, you just shouldn't do that, right? And let alone, being a Chinese and criticize the Chinese government, sometimes with not a particular reason. I mean, one thing he did was he put some kind of a sign on top of the embassy in Beijing to show the bad air quality in Beijing. You understand this irritates not just the Chinese government, it irritates everybody living in Beijing. I remember even my parents who rarely talks, my mother who rarely talked politics with me, she was telling me this. And so
Yeah.
that, in the end,
I,
Obama felt like it has to take him back, call him back to Washington. But it's so he misunderstood that why Obama put him there, right? That
yeah.
it's
Well,
counterproductive.
absolutely, completely counterproductive. I would say that Obama did the same, except of course he wasn't Russian, but he sent Michael McFaul to become U.S. ambassador to Moscow. And of course,
Okay.
McFaul is an academic and he's not Russian. But and the story was the story was that he was being sent to improve relations between the US and Russia. But if anybody knew anything about his books and was familiar with his opinions, they would have known that he would achieve the exact opposite. Because McFaul hated Russia, or at least he hates everything about the political system there that he knows or imagines. So he was a disastrous ambassador. It sounds exactly like the same thing. Obama listened to some very strange people. I have to say this. And besides, one can see that there might be a kind of logic in saying to yourself, well, this is a Chinese American, so why don't we send him to Beijing and he's going to get on with the Chinese? But really, you shouldn't think like that. You should look for a person who knows China, who's interested in China, who studied China, who's got a genuine empathy and feeling for the country. And that's the kind of person you want as your ambassador. An ambassador should like the country he or
Yeah.
she is posted to. I mean, otherwise they cannot work as an ambassador.
Well, that seems I mean, I agree with you, but it seems like has changed.
Yeah.
The diplomat is no longer that diplomatic anymore. Like the current one, what is his name? Nicholas someone. He's also very
Whatever.
critical of China.
Yeah.
He had an interview with 60 Minutes, and it's full of how very critical of China in all aspects. China threat. China is so dangerous. China is a threat to the US. I just feel like he, being a diplomat, he shouldn't be saying those things, right? I mean, there are plenty of people who can say those things, but in his position, he should do the opposite. He should
Well,
try to tell people that's not true, right? We should work with China, right? Being a
well, of
diplomat.
course, of course. Well, of course, he shouldn't. I mean, he should never be. He shouldn't be giving interviews at all. Certainly not interviews of that kind. I mean, that is to completely misunderstand what the role of a diplomat is. In fact,
Yeah.
it is not. It is it is completely inconsistent with being a
Mm.
diplomat. Once upon a time, an ambassador who behaved that way and who was so rude about the country he was posted to could very easily have found himself persona non grata. I'm not making that up, by the way. I mean, there's just to give an example that immediately springs to my mind. In 1870, the French ambassador to Germany tried to speak to the German emperor and conveyed to the German emperor some incredibly rude comments that the French government wanted to communicate to the German emperor. And the German emperor said, "Look, I'm in the middle of rest period. Can you just wait outside?" And anyway, the whole thing got spun out of control, and because this ambassador was so pushy and so aggressive that it led to a war between Germany and France. I mean, this particular incident, which France lost, by the way. So, I mean, it tells you that ambassadors need to choose their words carefully and to behave always in an appropriate way. So, there it is. That is, but America doesn't do diplomacy. I mean, the Americans have lost all ability to understand what diplomacy is. Their idea of diplomacy is that you make demands, you insist that the other side capitulate to them. You're as rude and horrible about them as you can possibly be. And that's what Americans think diplomacy is.
Yeah, we use the word when we were learning the word diplomacy, right? Or we are saying this
Mm,
person is a very diplomatic person.
mm,
Basically, it's
mm.
saying this person is very polite, very
Yeah,
right, not bullying, right? It's the opposite of
yeah,
bullying. Okay, person is very diplomatic. That's where diplomatic
yeah,
coming from, but okay,
yeah.
not anymore.
Absolutely not anymore. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, before I let you go, just to keep you something entertaining regarding the election. So I think the day before the election, there was something happened to this. Have you heard about this squirrel, Peanut? Squirrel the Peanut. So
No.
apparently in New York, the state of New York, there's a guy called Mike. So he rescued a squirrel whose mother was hit by a bus. And so he raised this squirrel. Not only that, he also took all the videos. And so lots of people following him on social media. So this Peanut, the squirrel's name is Peanut, is a very famous squirrel. I didn't know that, but a lot of people following him just saw him, growing up with this guy and they're very attached to Mike. But for whatever reason, somebody alerted the police saying that he was raising some illegal wild animals in his house. And guess what happened? There were a group of policemen, at least five of them, showed up outside his house. And they had some, I guess, a search warrant saying they have to take away the squirrel, the Peanut. Not only the squirrel, the Peanut, but there's also a Fred, the raccoon. So they searched the house for 5 hours. And during that time, Mike and his family are not allowed to enter the house. Not only that, even when he went to the bathroom, they have to escort him to the bathroom. So there was a whole ordeal in order to capture those two animals. And in the end, they did. They took them. And somewhere along the way, the two animals was, of course, very agitated. So they bit someone. Now they have to do some tests. In order to do the rabies test, they have to kill the animal. So those two animals were killed. And the whole internet, the social network, everybody got angry, very upset to the degree Elon Musk, JD Vance, and of course, Donald Trump, everybody came out and criticized. Now, I know they're playing this right before the election, but they do have a point, like Vance were saying, you don't have better things to do. You have to harass this guy, this Mike person, nice person, and kill those two animals. So I think that's probably illustrate why they lost. The Democrat lost it. I think that's probably has something to do with it.
I think you're absolutely right, because of course the trouble is it's consistent with the way they behave all the time. I mean, self-importance, bureaucracy, authoritarianism, all of this together, and ultimately the stupidity behind it. I mean, leave this person and his animals, his pets alone. I mean, really, this is what the land of the brave and the free has become. Not so brave, it would seem, because they're afraid about getting nipped, and not so free either.
And then somebody also find out who was the person who alerted the police. Apparently, it's a naturalist photographer. So that's also very ironic, right? This woman is supposed to love nature, would alert police to harassing this person who rescued animals from the wild. It's just the whole thing is just so, such a bonanza, such a dramatic thing that is so interesting happened right before the election. I just find that's interesting. So
it is. It absolutely. It tells you so much about. You so much about America and the America of today. I mean, it really does, and it does. It does actually explain why people are voting in the way that they are, because people just can see both the cruelty and the absurdity of it.
Now, I do want to ask you this. Do you think Trump will solve the illegal immigrant thing? I mean, it's a big thing for him, but do you think he will get it solved?
No, he won't solve it completely, but he might be able to make a difference.
Okay.
And provide the big thing in politics is not always to succeed completely, but to give the impression that you're making a real effort and that you're achieving something. And then people will probably say to themselves, well, he didn't deliver 100%. He only delivered 40%, but at least that's something. And it does show that he cares, and will go on voting for him for that reason. And of course, they won't be voting for him. But anyway, that's because he can't stand again. But I think that is what's going to happen. The problem with the border is so completely out of control. In America, the whole immigration thing is so completely out of control, and the bureaucracy and by the way, so much of the corporate world wants this process to continue, that changing it, really turning it round, would require a bureaucratic and political revolution. And I don't think Trump has the political strength or the political discipline to do something like that. You know,
It has
if I can
become
just
a,
give an example, go. I mean,
go ahead.
as every Chinese person knows, thanks to the British, China from the early 19th century had a problem with opium. And then the Communist Party came to power and they brought it to an end. They finished it. They had that kind of political discipline and organization and stuff. They don't get enough credit for it either, by the way. Nobody in the West, certainly no one in Britain ever talks about that. But they did. That's the kind of change that ending the immigrant problem in the United States would require. And I don't think Trump has that kind of a sense of authority and the sense of, strength of purpose and focus and discipline to achieve something like that.
Well, Trump actually said that he did mention that people in China has no mercy for those drug dealers, and he did actually bring out China as a good example for dealing with that. And then regarding the border, I wanted to say was that the border, the illegal immigrant thing has become such a big business. I think Tucker Carlson had a program about that, talking about that aspect of it. Once you have so many people making money out of this whole thing, then it's getting harder and harder. It's very hard because they will fight back. They want to keep their business. Yeah.
Well, of course, they will fight back. And as I said, that again is where the difference was, because in the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party was not going to be stopped by the fact that there were all of these, constituencies that wanted to. But in the United States today, pushing back, defeating the corporate world that benefits from this, stopping all of these businesses, fighting the bureaucracy, fighting the legal communities that operate these things. I don't see it myself. I think it's almost impossible, as it would require a political revolution. And Trump is not promising a revolution. I mean, he is not a revolutionary figure, whatever some people may think.
Yeah. But JD Vance is rising, so he's somebody we need to look for, right? So we will see.
Absolutely. We will see. We will see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophia. Enjoy your time in Beijing, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Will you be in Beijing also?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's my plan for now. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Excellent.
See you next time.
Have a great time. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.